everybody. I'm Joan Casey. I'm an assistant professor at Columbia University. I'm here with Marianthi, and we represent the North American chapter of ISEE. We're really excited today to have Joel KAUFMAN here with us to provide some updates from environmental health perspectives, where he's just taken over as the editor-in-chief. I think he'll cover some things from submitting manuscripts, writing, and then we'll have a bunch of time for question and answer with Dr. KAUFMAN. So that should be fun. I just want to remind everyone to please mute themselves. I think we have it enabled, so you can do that. And this is recorded, so we'll post it on the ISEE YouTube channel either tomorrow or the next day. And if you have questions, let's do that via the chat. And at the end, Marianthi or I will read those questions. Okay, thanks a lot. Go ahead and take it away, Joel.
Okay, so hi. Yeah, it's, thanks for the invitation to come and talk. I realize that since you made me the host, however, I'm going to have to keep one eye on the waiting room all the time. So that might be a bit of an annoyance here, because people keep pinging in that they're waiting and I have to let them in while I'm talking.
Okay.
I don't know if there's a way to have more than one host or not.
That would be ideal. Okay, let me try something else.
I think that worked because you are the host now, Joan, yep. And we can still see the slide, so it's fine.
Exactly. So.
Okay, so let's see if I can advance my slides. So thanks for this invitation. Can you guys still hear me? Yeah.
You sound good.
Okay, so thanks for the invitation. Happy to talk to the North American chapter of ISEE, of which I am, of course, a member, and happy to be an active member of ISEE, currently on the executive council of the society. And as Joan mentioned, as of February, became the editor-in-chief of Environmental Health Perspectives. And Joan and Marianthi asked me to give a talk, a little bit about the journal, a little bit about where it's going, how to publish in it, how to review for it, and so forth. I'm going to try to go over all of that in about 40 minutes and leave some time for some discussion at the end, hopefully cover the topics you guys are interested in. I know there's a mix of people on this, from early career to more established investigators, so I want to be respectful of everybody, but I think probably I personally think that a major audience of this is the early career people, so some of the advice on writing and publishing is probably a little more focused to that audience. I should explain the background here. My virtual background is at the University of Washington's Suzzallo Library Reading Room. Of course, I'm not really there, but I guess that's a little bit better background than my converted attic office here at home. So we'll go from that. So let's see if my slide advance is working. So I think most of you are familiar with environmental health perspectives. As I mentioned, in February, I became the editor-in-chief, taking over from Sally Darney, who had a distinguished career, both as a scientist and as the last editor-in-chief of the journal. And the transition here, one of the things to note is that the journal previously, the editors of the journal had been full-time NIEHS staff and this science staff. And this was a change for the journal to have a editor-in-chief who was not a internal person, but an external person who was doing this as a part-time position. And I am, in fact, still a faculty member at the University of Washington, thus the background, as while doing this job as a part-time part of my work. And I just want to start by talking a little bit about EHP, which is an unusual journal. As people look at the various journals that they could publish in or read, EHP has three attributes that, if you take them together, are an unusual set of attributes. One is that it's an open access journal, so that is all the content is freely accessible online. And that's become an increasingly common model, but what's uncommon about EHP is that it has no author or subscription fees. There's no fees to publish in the journal or submit papers to the journal. So that's a difference. And that's enabled really by the commitment from the NIH, the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, that supports the journal and is the publisher of the journal and is committed to it. As a result, EHP has had the opportunity to be a high impact journal. And in my opinion, it is and should be remaining the premier international scholarly journal of the environmental health sciences. Now, there's a variety of ways of measuring that. I'm not going to go into detail on that today, but we could talk more about that. But EHP has a commitment to publishing the highest quality work in the environmental health sciences. And my own goal is that it be the journal in which environmental health scientists, including environmental epidemiologists, strive to publish their best work. And we have a commitment to inspiring trust from readers by providing thoroughly peer-reviewed original research, reviews, and commentaries. But one of the things that's really important to recognize is that the environmental health sciences are several contributing disciplines. And it's important that the journal be trying and succeeding in publishing sort of the best work, most exciting and dynamic findings from each of these disciplines. And in addition to the work that we do in publishing papers, original research articles, and reviews and commentaries, the journal has also kept a cutting edge face in terms of social media and emerging media technologies, which we're proud of and will continue to maintain going forward. And the journal also has a really great reputation for publication ethics, which we are committed to maintaining. And the one other thing that sort of sets EHP apart from, I believe, from other journals is that because of its support from the NIH, I believe it has a special responsibility to publish science that influences not only other scientists, but also policymakers and the public health community. Last year, coincidentally, I and Cindy Curl published this figure in a commentary in EHP talking about the translational research framework, a way to think of the environmental health sciences. And I bring this way of thinking about the disciplines of environmental health science to the journal and the kinds of things that we're interested in. Because unlike in the traditional translational research paradigm, the sort of T1 to T5 paradigm, where you're talking about discoveries at the bench, moving to clinical work, clinical improvements in clinical care. In the environmental health sciences, most folks working in this field are really focused on population level health impacts. And so the things that we do and the reasons that we do them and the disciplines that we use are slightly different, in some cases substantially different. And one reason it's important in talking to a group like this is that in our area, epidemiology ends up being one of the important core disciplines whose work is involved actually at all of the stages of research translation. Epidemiology is only one of the disciplines involved in sort of the core science development part, but it's important really at each, and it's also really important to be working with other investigators as well. So as part of my work at the journal, I see part of my work is now to make sure we keep a balance of the disciplines and topics that we're covering, and that we're having outreach to all of the key disciplines, in addition to epidemiology, toxicology, exposure sciences, biostatistics, exposure biology, risk assessment, clinical research, community engaged research, implementation science, and policy development and evaluation. And we do pay attention not only to the balance of topics, but the balance of disciplines rather, but also the balance of topics. So we often think about the kinds of things that we do research on as being the topic that's interesting, but there's both the set of traditional environmental health science topics, as well as emerging and increasingly important areas in planetary health and sustainability. And I like to think that, we should be able to look at the end of a year at what we've published and imagine a matrix where the journal is publishing the best science in sort of covering the whole field of both the disciplines as well as topics that we're interested in. So that's just a way of thinking about it. We're not very good yet at tracking all of this, and we're going to be working better at it. But I do think that it's important that all of the environmental health science disciplines should see themselves in the journal, should feel like this is their journal. And although it might seem funny to this audience, one of the words that I hear from people is that everybody thinks that this is only a journal of environmental epidemiology, and we can't just, that isn't what the journal is. That's not who our audience is. That's not all that NIEHS is interested in, and that's not all that I think we should be interested in either. So we have to be interesting to all of these groups, but really what I'm focused on is trying to get people to submit their best science to the journal, and so the journal can stay at the top of the field that we're in. So just a little bit of, to show you the way that articles break down in the journal. This is authors' own sort of self-description of the topic that they're working on. You can see epidemiology is in fact the largest single group, both of those submissions and those accepted papers in the journal. But there's many other disciplines represented. And in general, it's interesting to see that the number of papers that have been published. So what we're looking at thus far is, what we're looking at here is papers published so far through the beginning of really this last week that were submitted during calendar year 2019. So the initial submission was in 2019, and this is what we can see has come out so far. So actually there will continue to be more papers that were submitted, especially towards the end of 2019, that are just working their way through the review process now. But you can see that pretty much our numbers are a pretty good match in terms of who's coming, what types of disciplines people are coming from, and how they're represented in what's published in the journal. So what should journals be doing? What's the role of a journal? In journals, I believe the journals can, and then EHP in particular should, be fostering environmental health knowledge transmission to all our stakeholders. And we tend to think of scholarly journals as having be by researchers for researchers. But in reality, we have several other audiences that are important, and EHP has to be alert to all of them. We're not just focusing on researchers, but we're focusing on policymakers, the public, and really everybody who might be interested in this material. And to some extent, we use different pieces of the journal and its website and social media to appeal to different groups, but we're trying to appeal to all of them. Now, what's the scope of the journal? The journal is the journal of the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. It's NIEHS is part of the NIH. The focus of the journal, the scope of the journal is really on content that advances our understanding of the relationship between the environment and human health. So, and that's often one of the first things we're looking at when we're looking at the scope of a paper is that, is it related to the environment, and is it related to human health? And we sort of have to cross both of those check off both of those boxes for the paper. This considers the complexity of environmental factors that interact across life course, and takes into account lifestyle issues, how those might be effect modifiers, or how particular groups might be particularly at risk. And there's a pretty wide variety of things that we do consider environmental. So it's worth, we try to be fairly inclusive in our definition of what's an environmental topic. Our major publication type are original research articles, and our focus really on those is trying to make them timely and impactful And we're, of course, showing the metrics on papers and so forth and tracking attention to it. We also publish review papers where I'll be talking a little bit more about it, but not too much, or I can come up, we can discuss it more in the Q&A. We currently focus primarily on publishing systematic reviews with some scoping reviews. But our primary reviews that we're focusing now is really a focus on a systematic, unbiased review is the main thing that we want to see published, which of course always has to include a comprehensive search. We have to describe what the search is, a priori inclusion and exclusion criteria, and following one of the standard reporting guidelines that exist. We also publish commentaries. These commentaries are not sometimes expert recommendations, sometimes somebody's just opinion about something. Generally, try to have it be as science-based as well. Typically focused on solving a problem, filling an information gap. What's the next step in research? A different way of thinking about things, maybe from what's generally done. In the past, EHP actually dedicated a lot of its pages to publishing workshop reports, and has pretty much moved away from publishing workshop reports now, mostly focused now on, it can be based on the outcomes of a workshop, but generally is focused more on, sort of the actual topic, recommendations, and so forth, and not just a revisiting of a workshop that was held. And the EHP does also publish on occasion editorials and consensus statements, but fewer of both of those. The peer review process is not too dissimilar from other journals. We're going to be making some changes to it. I am not really ready to talk in detail about the changes that we'll have, but I think these general broad brushstrokes are, the way it has worked and the way it will continue to work, which is that we maintain a board of associate editors who are experts across the disciplines and topics that people submit papers on, who all have a broad knowledge of environmental health and are generally well connected to a diverse network of scientists who they can then support or invite to be reviewers. And then they work with staff in the office to handle the peer review processes. We use a single blind peer review process, which is still the most common approach that's used in publishing now. That is that the reviewers know who the authors are, but the authors don't know who the reviewers are. We typically solicit 3 reviews on a paper. Sometimes we're able to make a decision with 2 reviews, and the associate editor summarizes the reviews, looks to see how the paper is fitting into the goals of the journal, and makes a recommendation to the science editors and editor-in-chief for a final decision. And some of this is in motion right now. We're moving around some of these processes, but this is pretty standard in what we do. I also just want to highlight the EHP's dedication to publishing rigorous science. It's fully and transparently reported. It's really important that all papers have a clear research question. This is primarily, again, talking about original research articles. Make a significant scientific advance over previously published science. Another thing that we pay special attention to, and it does, it is a contrast to some extremely high impact papers that have come to sort of reduce their level of interest in methods, is that the journal is extremely interested in understanding the approach and methodologies used, including the study design and statistical analysis. And it is one of the things that I could highlight is that many authors overlook doing a real thorough description of the study design and methods. So I want to highlight that, make that clear. If you're using one of the established reporting guidelines, you should follow those and make sure that you're adhering to those as well. So looking ahead at things that I want to just talk a little bit about, things that may be changing, things that, as I moved into this role, talking with the other leadership at the journal and at the Institute about what we might want to do. We're considering some changes to the types of articles and guidelines, specifically thinking about how we think about review papers, whether there's a role for sort of a good narrative invited review on a particularly important topic. Publishing a small number of these is probably a place we're going to move to. Potentially some new article types, that's still under discussion. Changing possibly some of the policies that we've had about correspondence at the journal and seeing if we can't open it up a little bit more to be a little more responsive to correspondence that we receive. We're going to obviously be paying attention, as I spoke before, about the balance of article subjects and disciplines. And we are going to be making some changes to the editorial peer review processes. And this is going to involve no substantial changes to what I described before, but it is going to involve some changes with the role probably of deputy editors that we're probably going to be rolling out in the near future, as well as revising the expectations for both handling editors, reviewers, and members of our editorial review board. I'm looking to consider the possibility of having a smaller number of members of the associate editor board and the editorial review board, but get those people more involved in sort of the life of the journal with more regular engagement with the editors, maybe a slightly higher workload, but more involvement with the journal and understanding what the journal is trying to accomplish. And then the other thing, and I want to spend a little bit of time about it, is talking about some new initiatives we're going to be rolling out. None are quite ready for prime time yet, but we'll be rolling out some new initiatives for early career scientists. And really the goal here is to get early career scientists engaged in the journal, excited about the journal, thinking that this is where they want to publish their work, thinking that this is where you'd like to have your a big part of your career focused on environmental health perspectives, getting early career scientists involved as reviewers in the journal, advisors to the journal, and I'm anticipating that over the next couple of months we'll be soliciting interest in an early career investigator advisory group who can help work with the journal in terms of making sure we're responsive to the needs of early career investigators, having ways for early career investigators to get involved in the journal, and also how to sort of advance as an investigator in the scientific community. Probably also going to try to roll out some opportunities for more early career investigators to be part of editorial decision making, to work alongside of more senior editors to see how that process goes on, so that people can see both how journals work and get a sense of whether that's something that they might want to be more involved with as their career moves forward. I like to think of the investigator's life with a journal much as we think about advancement in other parts of your career. So you start off with the journal primarily as a reader, you become a contributor and a reader, you become a contributor and a reader and a reviewer. You can then advance, become a member, for example, of the editorial board member, where you're called upon on a regular basis to do reviews, and then advance to being an associate editor, where you're making the decisions about what papers you want to be involved with. And I want to think of it as in that way, and have scientists who are excited about the range of the environmental health sciences get involved in the journal from all the disciplines that I've mentioned. So in terms of publishing in environmental health perspectives, we're often asked what's an appropriate paper, what are we looking for? And I think, it really comes down to a relatively small number of things that we're looking at. Is the paper in scope for the journal? Is what the paper is talking about novel in some way? Is the paper valid? That is, does the paper actually do what it says it's doing, and are the methods appropriate, and so forth? Is the paper adequately reported, and is the writing decent? And that's that's the core. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this when I talk about reviewing papers, but this is really what we're looking at. And we can have long lists of what we do and checklists and so forth, but it really comes down in my eyes, most of the time to these factors. So this isn't really the right forum, although it would be interesting to do, maybe as a longer workshop, and our journal has traditionally conducted workshops on the topic of how to write and publish scientific papers. We can't cover all these topics here. I'm going to just touch on a few of the issues in brief and leave the rest for some other venue. But it is important, particularly for new investigators, to be keeping in mind the basic questions. Why do we write manuscripts? How should a manuscript be constructed? And the structure of a manuscript has to be different for different journals. So you have to look at what papers look like in the journals that you're interested in, and also look at the instructions that the journal has. Good writing is incredibly important, and I have a few slides on that topic. You also have to know what topics and what's the kind of level of novelty that that your journal of interest is looking for. It's important to understand the peer review processes and how to interpret the reviews. It's worth talking a little bit about authorship issues, though again, that could be a whole seminar in and of itself. There's of course important ethical issues and lots more that come to, which hopefully people mostly learn in the course of their coming up with good mentorship and how to do that. We could spend, again, a lot of time thinking about why we write manuscripts. And really, we write manuscripts for the same reasons that we do science, that we ask questions. And we write papers because we are forming this epistemic community. It's a global network of knowledge-based professionals. So the whole process of publishing and writing is part of forming this network that's advancing science. We're not just, sometimes I know sometimes it seems that we're doing it because we have to. It's expected of us by our supervisors. It's expected of us for promotion. But keeping in mind that the real goal here is the advancement of scientific and technical knowledge. Just want to say a little bit about the various bits of a paper and what we're looking for. The introduction to a paper. We should really know from the introduction of a paper why your paper is on an important topic, what you're motivated, what hypothesis you're testing, and so forth. The thing I really want to highlight here is that many people, convert something that was a thesis or a dissertation literature review into their introductions to the paper. For the most part, we don't want to see that. Rare that an introduction should be more than 2 to 3 paragraphs, and even can be briefer when appropriate. There's the things we're looking for in the methods. And again, this sets a journal like EHP apart from a journal like Science or Nature or Cell, where the methods are not of particular interest to the reviewers, remarkably, and are relegated to the end of the paper. We really are interested in the methods, and we want to understand what was done. We expect to see statements about the design and the subjects and settings, procedures, and so forth, statistical methods. Results also there are expectations. Look in the journal, see what goes on. Remember that tables and figures will be used by other people for slides. You really want to be telling a story with them. Many people will look at tables and figures and decide if the paper is interesting even to read or not. And again, discussions have to be short, but really summarizing the issue, recapping your novel findings, giving an interpretation of your finding, showing how it compares to other papers, giving the strengths and limitations, the implications in general for environmental health papers. These are public health implications, and then summary and future directions. It seems like a formulaic approach, but it's almost always the right approach to take in a discussion. All right, I want to just spend a couple minutes talking about economy in writing. While environmental health perspectives has in general relaxed its word limits, that doesn't mean that papers should be endlessly long. It's always important to be pithy. Be as brief as you can. Say things in as few words as possible. As Pascal wrote, I've made this letter longer than usual because I lack the time to make it short. The idea here is that it's always better if you put the time into something, you can make it briefer and more to the point. A classic telegram that was written to Mark Twain that said, "I need a 2-page short story in 2 days." It was a telegram, so it was just, need 2-page short story, 2 days. His response was, "No, can do. 2 pages, 2 days. Can do 30 pages in 2 days. Need 30 days to do 2 pages." The point here is that it takes more time to write a brief paper, but it's almost always worth it, and your readers will always appreciate it, and the reviewers will appreciate it as well. It's surprising, but all too common, that the most simple writing issues plague people submitting papers to scientific journals. It's frustrating and can be a big off-putting to reviewers and editors at journals. So always look, give it a second look. Does the paper look good? Is this really a good sentence? Look at your capitalization. Pay attention to how Word gives you those red lines under your words. There's usually a reason for that. Either fix it or know that it's wrong, but it's usually right. Edit for style, read for spelling errors. Spell check won't catch a lot of errors, than, and so forth. Read again for sentence structure. Have somebody else read the paper. Have a native English speaker read the paper over to make sure that it reads like English. Incredibly important. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the whole process of submitting a manuscript. Just to review again, you submit a paper, the editor reads it, decides to reject or send it for review. The reviewers provide detailed critiques. The editor makes a decision and mails you the response letter or emails you the response letter and critiques. How long does this take? People should have reasonable expectations. But in my mind, the reasonable expectations at this point in time are that the process should be taking somewhere between 2 weeks and 3 months, depending on how closely scrutinized your paper is. That is 2 weeks for is a reasonable expectation for the initial decision about whether a paper is going to be sent for review or not. So within that time, if it hasn't been sent for review, you should be expecting that it won't be. But sometimes we go a little longer in our journal, and we're working on that. As you saw at the beginning, if you look closely at the numbers that we presented, we're accepting fewer than 9% of submissions to the journal at this point. That doesn't mean that you haven't put a huge amount of work into it, and we recognize that virtually all papers that we receive represent diligent, careful work and careful analysis and writing. If your paper is rejected, there are a variety of reasons for that. One is that you've sent it to the wrong place. The second is that the paper is actually not good. Or not good enough for the journal that you've submitted it to, or another is that it's too radical. And it is reasonable to still say that paradigm shifting work is difficult to publish, even when impeccable, and is hard sometimes for reviewers to get around. And as much as we try to be alert to that, it does sometimes happen. This flow chart, which I'm not going to go through in detail, is just really, an interesting observation about when you get a rejection letter. First of all, you should read it a little more closely. Sometimes what appears to be a rejection letter from a journal, we try to be clear at EHP, other journals maybe not always so much, is actually what's considered sort of a conditional rejection. That is, it's giving you some clue about what you might do to change the paper. Or sometimes it's actually an accept with changes decision. So as you move down this, unless you want to give up on the paper and think that it has no chance of publication success, which we generally advise against people thinking if you've put the time into it, that you work through preparing it either for the same journal or for a different journal. But always incorporate the editorial comments that you received back on the paper if you receive them. submit it maybe to a different, probably lower impact journal. But if you receive reviews back, it's always wise to revise your paper in response to those reviews. It will improve your chance of acceptance and take into account the fact that it's not that unlikely that your paper will end up being reviewed by the same person again at a different journal. I do want to just give a couple of shout outs to problems that do happen with submissions that we receive, including plagiarism. We do have some automated ways to look for plagiarism, but just keep in mind always when writing papers that you have to cite appropriately. You have to reword things even that may be the same as work that you've done before. Never just put in the exact same words again. If you're using something that somebody else has published, you need to ask permission. And if you have questions about whether it counts as plagiarism, you should ask someone's opinion. We're also concerned about so-called salami publication, where people are trying to slice as thinly at the science as possible in their papers. It's hard to detect this. I think in general, you just want to discourage people from doing it. If you want to publish in a high impact journal, you're better off having a beefier paper that has more meat to it, rather than trying to publish as many papers as possible, in my opinion. But it still happens, and we're not aware of what's being submitted at other papers. I recently came across these two papers that were published at almost exactly the same time in two separate journals on the same study. One was published in BMJ, one was published in Lancet, on the same trial of a maternal pertussis vaccine, and they sliced out the safety from the efficacy. Neither of those papers stands alone to help you understand what's going on with this item. And it's just remarkable to me that people have sort of the willingness to do that. All right, I'm going to shift and spend a couple minutes talking about how to review a paper. I'm not going to go into the exhaustive detail on this. I just want to talk mostly about how I review a paper. And you should look, whatever journal you're submitting to, you should see the journals give advice on how to structure a review. You should follow those instructions. So I'm reviewing a paper with a window on those, with a lens on those same items that I was interested in. That is, first I'm looking at scope and novelty. So I'm asking the question, what is this paper trying to accomplish? And if they were able to accomplish that, setting aside how good their methods and results are, setting aside that, if they were able to do what they set out to do, these authors, would that be of interest to readers of this journal? So that's about scope and novelty. Once I've assessed that, then I move on to, does the study accomplish that goal that it wanted to do? So I can stop after that first question if I don't think it has sufficient scope and novelty at the editorial phase. As a reviewer, you don't have the luxury. You still have to move through all of these things and think through the validity of the paper. This is a different question from whether the investigators get the results they want to see. So you have to sort of look through, what were the reviewers hoping to see? What have they found? And has what they found, have they used valid methods and approaches and analysis? Then is the paper written in a way that's clear and complete? This addresses that issue of adequacy of reporting and writing. So I then, when I'm writing up my review, I summarize the main issues that drove my level of enthusiasm in the paper. And then I give detailed comments on the methods, the writing, the reporting, the discussion, and the reasonableness of the conclusions. I just want to highlight also for people to remember the golden rule. Don't put something into a review that you would not want someone to write about your paper. Even so, read it over. Have you said something that might be interpreted as saying something like, this work was a waste of time. This work was a waste of money. This is, garbage. That really does not have a place in reviews. And think about how you would feel if you got that review back on a paper. So, all right. I'm gonna just move quickly through a variety of other things now. We've already talked about the kinds of papers that EHP publishes, original research, reviews, and commentaries. And I think I've already covered this in a fair amount of detail already, so I'm gonna skip through this. We're interested in understanding the real world and applying real world issues to understanding environmental health sciences. We understand that, particularly in observational science, it's hard to have the most precise, experimentally controlled environments for our studies, and we understand that. And you have to think about it with the same complexity and explain why what you're displaying is really reflective of the real world. We're interested in seeing cutting edge approaches and tools. So papers that have more novelty in methods are of more interest to us. And this applies not just to the experimental sciences, but also to the observational methods. We have a very detailed set of guidelines on the website, and we would always anticipate that somebody's looked at this before they submitted the paper. We've talked before about the stages of review at EHP. You should know that the triage or preliminary assessment, sometimes called the desk review of a paper, is completed, and that about 80% of the papers, between 60 and 80% of the papers are rejected at this stage. We try to do it as quickly as possible. And again, it's primarily focused on whether it's within the journal scope and exciting or novel and relevant to the field, whether it seems to present a sound rationale. We generally will spend less time on the actual details of the paper's methods and leave that for the peer review processes, but we will look to see if they've applied an appropriate design and analysis to address the research question during the preliminary assessment. So we send out about 20 papers out to be handled by an associate editor. And I've already said most of this, I think, what's on this slide, the kinds of reasons that papers get rejected at that first stage. These are the common deficiencies that in rigor that we see in study design and in statistical analysis, and in the overstating of the importance of the results. I think people need to be circumspect in saying what they are finding. And we often have issues that come up with transparencies, but we don't have enough methodological details. Keep in mind that we're very flexible with regard to word limits so that we can understand what was done and so that other people can do it again. And if there's any question about whether it's too much detail, there's rarely any problem at this point in putting additional details into an online supplement. We follow a variety of the standard now reporting guidelines that are out there. There's different reporting guidelines for observational studies, animal studies, and systematic reviews. And we're alert to those and are looking at those early on. Want to just tell people a little bit about how to make a revised manuscript when you've gotten your peer review comments back. It's incredibly important that you are complete, detailed, respectful, and responsive. Even if you don't agree with it, you should have a respectful reply to the reviewer, keeping in mind that in most cases, the same reviewer is going to get the paper back again if there's a lot of reviews pending, a lot of issues still to be revised in the paper. Okay. All right. In the interest of time, I'm going to start to wrap up here. I want to talk a little bit about our timeliness at the journal, which I know is a concern of people. This is for papers that have had a decision thus far in 2020. The time to a first decision on submission has a mean of 25 days with a median of 16 days. And that median is driven by that big chunk of papers that are not sent out for peer review. So that's sort of the time that it's currently taking us for the triage reviews. There are outliers in here. We're working to address them. And we're sort of trying to drill down on all of the bottlenecks in our processes. The time from submission to final decision for accepted papers, which includes, in every case almost, substantial time back with the author in preparing revisions, is at this point about 174 days between, as a mean and a median of 155, between when a paper was submitted and when a paper is finally gets a final acceptance note. We recognize there's room for improvement, and we're working on it. And I think you can hold me to that over the next year. Hopefully, we'll be able to be presenting data that have shortened all of these times. So I'm really going to close out by thanking you for the invitation to give this talk. I want to recognize the rest of the editorial team. We also have a larger staff team involved with production of this of the journal, including several I see who have joined the call today and might be available if needed if we want to have some discussion afterwards. Just remind you that we want to be and we strive to be the global leader in this space, publishing important work dedicated to making new knowledge accessible and understandable. You've all seen these numbers before. We're trying not to be slaves to impact factors, although many audiences are extremely interested in publishing their papers in the highest impact journal by these rankings, so we do have to be alert to them. I should add that among toxicology journals, for example, the only journal which has a higher impact factor is the annual reviews, which obviously doesn't publish original content. We hope that you'll stay in the loop with the journal. We do have social media and other ways to reach us. And we do want to hear from you. And I want to highlight to you all that I am very open to hearing from you individually. If you have concerns about the journal, comments about the journal, want to talk about something, want to get more involved in the journal, please let me know. So at that point, I think we will close and open this up for discussion. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Joel. That was very informative. We have some questions coming in already. The first one is, will the journal move towards double-blind reviews? What is the rationale to maintain the practice of the single-blind review process that's currently used?
Well, that's a good question. At this point, the journal hasn't really made any move towards a double-blind. So just to be clear, you can move both towards unblinded and double-blinded. So right now we're single-blinded. The questioner wanted to know why we don't move to double-blinded. So double-blinded, there are journals that do that, where they mask the authors to the reviewers. The reality of that is that if you have reviewers who are knowledgeable about the field and can parse a paper well enough, you can usually tell what group a paper is coming from. So blinding is never very effective in that regard. On the other side of the equation is the unblinded reviews, which there are also journals that have moved to, where the identity of reviewers is made clear to the authors. And there's a lot of appeal to that and reasons to do that in the sake of transparency and openness. The real obstacle to this at this point in time is that it's already one of the biggest challenges for journals is the ability to get reviews on papers. And if we were to move towards unblinded review, we know that it would even further reduce our pool of potential reviewers. So until we can address that, I don't think we're moving in that direction either. So for the time being, I think we're staying where we are, but I'm always open to hear arguments otherwise, and we're in no ways fixed on that place.
Great. Okay, we have a question from Kelvin Fong about early career scientists. He's asking where you see that group of people fitting into the progression in one's involvement with EHP, from reader and contributor, where will kind of the early career scientists get slotted in?
Well, I think early career scientists need to be slotted in well, let me just say that starting with associate editor in general, it's hard to be an associate editor at the earliest stages of career because people just at that point don't have the network of people to call upon to do reviews, for example, or the broad knowledge of who's doing what everywhere in a field. But everything short of that, I think that getting early career investigators involved as reviewers and as editorial review board members is entirely reasonable. We won't be inviting people to join our editorial review board, for example, until we have experience with them as a reviewer. But if someone shows that they're a great reviewer, they can, that's a reasonable progression of their next step and to become a kind of a regular reviewer. So I think it's, I'd welcome a conversation with folks who are interested in that. And as I said, we're going to be reaching out, hopefully in the next couple of months, to start getting input from early career investigators on how they'd like to be more involved in the journal.
Okay, so now we have a question about low and middle income countries. It's noted by this person that there aren't that many papers from low and middle income countries being published at EHP, and they're curious if anything will be done to address this disparity.
So, so I mean, I think that the issue is, first of all, a minority of our submissions are from low and middle income countries. However, we also, what we really need to do is to have a dedicated effort to making sure that the quality of the submissions from low and middle income countries is comparable. We're definitely dedicated to publishing work from low and middle income countries. We'd like to see more of it in the journal. We want to get there. And so what we've actually been doing is some outreach to investigators. We have a few initiatives in place to do that. We have, of course, our largest single source of international submissions is from China, and we do have outreach, specific international outreach with Chinese translation of our author guidelines and so forth. But we have recently, for example, senior science editor, Dr. Jane Schroeder, gave a seminar for the Africa chapter of ISEE to try to improve the ability of investigators there to prepare papers to be submitted to EHP. And we'd be excited to work with other groups from low and middle income countries to help them get access to the resources required. There are challenges, to be sure, with regard to both the resources to do the highest quality research, as well as access to the English language writing skills that are expected in international journals. But we're committed to working with folks to try to solve those problems. And if people have suggestions of how we can do that, they should feel free to let me know, and we can let's try to work on that.
Great. Okay, now we have a question about when your manuscript gets rejected from EHP. Marianthi's asking, when, in your opinion, would an appeal to a rejection be justified, if ever? And what's the best way for authors to approach that?
Well, it's a good question. There's not an easy answer to the question. I think there are both formal and informal processes to review that. I think there's both the option in general of a formal appeal of a decision, as well as a submission of a de novo paper, which addresses the concerns that were raised before, if it's makes it a substantially different paper. I think that in general, it's probably worth having depending on, again, on your career stage. I think for an early career investigator, I think usually the first stop is going to be with your mentor or a trusted advisor about whether what their opinion of the paper is and what they think the next step should be. I think as people move on in their careers, it's perfectly reasonable to reach out to an editor, a science editor at the journal, you know, or a deputy editor or an associate editor to get a little more feedback into what they think might have been going on with the paper before making that decision. I think a lot of it will come down to whether at the end of the day you can get over that first, you know, particularly for a paper that was rejected at the triage stage, at that desk review stage. Can you get over the main questions about scope and novelty? Because if you can't get over that hurdle, then it's probably really is time to consider a different journal. If it's the issues about how well the paper is written or whether you've really made your point or said things clearly, those obviously can be can sort of get you back in the game. I don't think there's an easy answer to that question, but you know, I and I think the other folks who are, you know, associate editors and the deputy editors that we'll be naming, hopefully are going to be open to people having sort of informal conversations about that outside of the very formal review processes that we go through in the journal.
Great, that's interesting. The idea of updating and just submitting de novo to the same journal. I hadn't really thought about that before, so that's helpful.
Well, if so, I mean, if you can address, if you think that what, you know, if it's the scope and novelty issues, then it's sort of a non-starter, I think. But if it's the, you know, the other issues, then, you know, you can ask. I mean, sometimes it's, I mean, it depends. Sometimes the editors will actually sort of telegraph to you, or even say explicitly, that if you were to change A, B, and C, you know, this would be, could be, you know, considered as a new paper. You know, what we don't generally do in the observational sciences and epidemiology, like is done in the experimental world, is, you know, journals don't send an investigator back to the bench to do another experiment. We understand that epidemiologists have the same data set to work with again. But the question is, could you look at it a different way and provide an analysis that might be responsive to what the reviewer's concerns were?
So I have a question about when you're first submitting your article. You mentioned several criteria that you kind of look for in a paper that might be appropriate to send for review. What is the best way to convey that information? Do you think a really strong cover letter is critical, or should the manuscript abstract stand on its own? Where is it best for people to try to convey that information?
Yeah, I mean, those are the I would say the three places where you want to make sure it gets through are cover letter, the abstract, and the introduction. And that's why one of the reasons why the introduction has to be brief and well written also. So, you know, the introduction is sort of laying the groundwork of what's been done before and why it was really important to look at this other thing that hadn't been done yet. But that's also really can just be put out explicitly in the cover letter. And that's where you can be a little more clear about why it's in the journal scope if it's not obvious, and what the novelty of the paper is if it's not obvious. You can assume that at a high impact journal, there's limited interest in publishing a paper that's on a topic that's already kind of well plumbed territory that isn't adding very much new to it. Even if the results are really robust, again, if we already know this thing, it's just going to be a hard sell. On the other hand, if a paper is really well done, very definitive, and showing results that are different from what's been seen before, or even, you know, even a paper that's robustly null when people have previously suggested that there are effects of something, those are going to be interesting, and you need to highlight that for the editors at the triage phase to see why this paper is doing something different.
Okay, I think that's a really good place for us to wrap up. We are just out of time now, so Joel, thank you very much for your time, and it some of these new directions sound very exciting, so we'll look forward to seeing them in practice. And from ISEE with our webinars, we're going to take a break over the summer, but we'll be back in the fall with some additional webinars, and you can find this webinar shortly on the ISEE YouTube channel. So thank you very much, Joel.
Thanks again for inviting me.